Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I am Caitlin. I'm the events coordinator for Madison Street Books. In the chat, I've posted where you can order Convergence, and it will also link you to Beth's book, Imagine It Forward. We're super excited to be hosting Deborah this evening for the launch of her book, Convergence. It's going to be a great conversation. If you have any questions throughout the night, please put them in the Ask a Question box down below. So I'm going to introduce our moderator for the evening. Hans Davies advises senior government officials and Fortune 500 business leaders on strategic planning, risk management, and innovation policy as it pertains to the security and protection domain. His clients in the defense and intelligence, critical infrastructure, aerospace, sports and entertainment, and hospitality industries rely on him to help them push their strategic thinking and position them to capitalize on emerging opportunities. Hans regularly presents to executive audiences on the future of security, critical infrastructure, and risk, building adaptive leadership models and developing an innovative culture. And with that, I'll give it over to Hans.
Excellent. Thank you, Caitlin. And I know no one is here to see me, so I'm going to turn it quickly over to our panelists. I'll start by introducing Beth Comstock. Is currently an author, corporate director, and advisor and nature conservationist. She built a career as a storyteller, marketer, and innovation champion as GE's first female vice chair, as well as chief marketing and commercial officer. She was president of integrated media at NBC Universal as part of her journey through media. She's a director at Nike, a trustee at National Geographic Society, and partner in Climate Real Impact Solutions. So Beth, thank you for joining us here tonight.
Hey, thanks, Hans. Nice to be here.
And I'll turn now to Deb Westphal. Deb, let me introduce you, although I could probably introduce you in a lot of different ways because I've had the pleasure of working with Deb for almost 15 years now. But Deb Westphal's career spans more than 30 years. In 1999, Alvin Toffler tapped her as one of the founding members of his eponymous consulting firm. A passionate humanist and lifelong learner, she has guided government and corporate leaders to challenge biases, ignite ideas, and build resilience for a secure future. And, with that, Deb, I got to tell you, I'm pretty excited because I actually have like a hard copy of the book, Convergence. And I know what a journey this has been for you. And I just want to kind of explore that for a second. Like, you title the book Convergence. In the foreword, Beth highlights convergence being the power of and. I like that idea of and. But in the first chapter, you talk about the location of the Galapagos Islands at the point where 3 ocean currents collide. That story is very meaningful. And so tell us what convergence is and what it really means to the future of business and society.
Sure. So thanks, Hans, and thank you for from Madison Street Books for having this and hosting this. This is awesome. But yeah, thanks for asking about the analogy of the Galapagos Islands. It for people that don't know much about the islands, they're just an incredible place. It's west of Ecuador, very special, has incredible plants and animals that you can't find anywhere else in the world. And what's really interesting is it is the location of these 3 major ocean currents that are converging. One comes from the south, one comes from the north, another one comes from the west. And, each one of them has their role in creating this, amazing balanced ecosystem for these plants and animals to exist. And I use that analogy because if any one of those currents gets stronger, then it would probably be the death and destruction of that area. And in today's environment, technology, human, and the future purpose of business are represented by those currents. And it's the same thing. If any one of the technology or humanity or the purpose of business gets stronger than the other 2, it will create an imbalance, and which is, I believe, we are at that point of imbalance, and it will create an environment that's not conducive to business. And so we need to get those back in balance. And that's why I use the analogy of the Galapagos Islands.
I like that. And I mean, the Galapagos has such a place in the environment, as well as sort of the storytelling and history of how we talk about the environment. Beth, I used your comments from the forward, that point of the convergence being about and. But you've often emphasized that importance for leaders taking responsibility for the big picture and sharing that with your team. How do you see that idea manifest itself in this book, Convergence?
Well, I think that's what Deb has done so well here. She's created this handbook, if you will, for leaders that gives them really a framework of how do I think about the future? I mean, if you're leading a company, you're leading a team, you're leading yourself, you have to be focused, at least in part, on the future. I'm a big believer in future-focused thinking. I titled my book, Imagine It Forward, partly because I had worked so much in corporate life, and I had seen that there weren't enough people comfortable thinking about the future. Often they delegated it to a strategy team, or we would hire a Toffler Associates or other to come in and tell us to think about it. And of course you need that help, but most people don't think that it's something they need to do regularly. I hope that maybe one of the good things, if there are many good things coming out of COVID, is that it has reminded business teams that they have to be much more adept at looking at where all these trends are converging around them. COVID reminded us of that. And so I think Deb's book is also particularly timely, where teams are picking their head up and saying, okay, I get it now. Where do I go? Well, there's Convergence now to help with that.
Excellent. And I like that you talk about the importance of leaders taking this responsibility on for themselves, that thinking about the future isn't just something you outsource. And, Deb, that idea of leadership comes through a lot in Convergence, right? It's Beth, I like the fact you used the word handbook. It's not quite a handbook, but it really is, in a sense, a guide for anyone that's in that leadership position. So, Deb, you talk about the importance of leaders and dealing with change, and it can be uncomfortable. But what are some of those important first steps you really think that leaders need to take when you're thinking about convergence and what the future is going to need?
Well, I think one of the first steps that leaders need to take is really internal to themselves, and they need to be much more self-aware. They need to understand where they come from as far as understanding what the purpose of business is, what they believe about business, what they believe about their market, and what's in the market and the changes that are happening. So that's where I think that starts. The work starts internally. I think the understanding of the convergence and the future focus is it starts with understanding the human system. And that is driving, pretty much everything. We think about the business system, we think about our economic system, our financial systems, but there's a human system that's out there that's incredibly powerful, and it's been empowered by technology and communication technology. We're 3 degrees of freedom from any person on Earth, soon to be 1 degree of freedom, and that is creating a real power for people to connect, to communicate, to raise, find commonality, to raise their voices and make demands and share ideas. And so I think that is the first step, is to really understand this human system, and that human system is really the thing that is ubiquitous overall, and where we need to start.
So again, I want to pull that thread on the human system. Like, you and I used to joke when we talk about the problems that are there in clients, or the issues with change, is that people tend to be the problem, right? Because they either get in their own way, they don't understand, they don't think forward. But I really like what you do in the book in terms of storytelling about that human system. And one stood out to me in particular. I wanted to see if you could talk a little more about it. In the chapter Serving the Needs of Every Market, you share a story of your experience in Uganda. And can you tell a little bit more about that story, especially for the folks out there in cyberspace, and how that illuminates some of your points about the human system and its relationship with other systems in Convergence?
Right. So I use that to really describe from a business perspective, as businesses are trying to do things for the human system, some of the considerations that they need to make, because and open their aperture. So I went to Uganda and traveled there to go see mountain gorillas. But the important part about this is I've been in the space business for about 30 years, been watching these amazing satellite communication companies try to connect the other 3 billion people on the planet. That is an amazing goal. So many things could happen if they do that. The possibility of education or telemedicine or, economic growth if they, people bring the internet to the rest of the half of the population. But when I traveled to Uganda, it was kind of eye-opening, because it's an emerging country. It's very hard to get to. Getting to where the mountain gorillas are is it's a couple of days worth of driving in Jeeps and bumpy roads and, amazing sites where there's women walking 10 miles to go get fresh water. And you wonder, these businesses that are trying to bring goodness into these areas, are they thinking about the broader human system? Because the people that are trying to connect to the internet don't even have fresh water. They don't have consistent electricity. They don't have the ability to buy things. They don't have computers. And even if they had money to buy computers, which they really don't, they don't have the means to get those and to run them. So opening the aperture to that human-centric future is what I would say is a business responsibility if you're trying to create that future market, is to meet people where they're at and understand where they're at. Now, those satellite communication companies probably can't solve those problems on their own. They're going to need new partnerships or business models or relationship with the government somehow. But that's what being a human-centric, having that human-centric perspective is to solve those problems in innovative ways.
So let's turn to Beth. You talk a lot about, in your book, Imagine It For, you talk about your experiences and your storytelling and connections, but you've run a business and innovation really at every level throughout your career. But again, that idea of connection and human-centric, it's really difficult. I mean, you yourself have talked about some of your experiences connecting the line employees with the vision that they're trying to do in terms of the jet engines and other things that you pull together. But why is that so hard for leaders? Why is a human-centric perspective so difficult? And how can Convergence help them change that mental model? How will it shape a mental model for someone that's at any level of leadership?
Well, I think often what happens when we think in business is we think it's all about just logic. It's all about numbers. It's all about getting to action, and all those things are important. But we often lose sight of the fact that it's humans that are doing that as much as AI and other machines are coming into bear. There's still humans behind that. We work as humans. We connect with humans. One of my favorite quotes of business was from. It's just sort of this basic tenet of without a customer, there is no business. And so that means we have to be good at connecting with people, at listening, whether it's with our teams, with our markets. And I think that's, as you guys, as Deb, as you're certainly looking your career and the work you do at Hoffler and what you're trying to set out in Convergence, is to really get behind the trend and understand what people are saying. And behind that is their need. I think this is one of the things I learned as a marketer, the best question you can ever ask in business is, what problem are we trying to solve? What need needs to be addressed? And so I think that's why Convergence is approaching this in a way that feels very now, maybe different than what people have thought. This isn't something that's normally taught in business school, or reinforced in normal day-to-day business operations. Too often we write it off as, oh, that's soft. I think Deb's making a case that it's essential. I believe that. So part of your brain, if you're really anybody in the world today, but let's talk about business people, part of your brain has to have a piece of it that's about thinking in the future. And you need to have a different perspective. You have to go places. You have to see where these things are converging. You actually have to understand it. And so I think that leaders need to call for that. And it starts with that human factor and recognizing that humans get overwhelmed by complexity. And Deb's putting that out in Convergence, that this is complex. And it's so much easier. The world is getting more complex. And there's a whole conversation we could have at some point about the difference between being complicated and complex. It's both. And technology makes it even more scary. You layer on that geopolitics, you layer on that, just natural human dynamics, and you can go crazy, but there are ways to think about that, and you must think about that. And that's why I think what Deb's trying to do here with Convergence is so helpful.
I want to kind of add to that, Hans, too. I think there's a really important, and the third current, or that third force that has to be stay in balance here, is the purpose of a business. And what Beth just said is that we don't learn this in business school. What we learn in business school is the sole purpose of a business is to maximize shareholder profit. And that shareholder profit is for the few. It's the few shareholders. It's not for the many. And there is a movement with, Larry Fink and BlackRock and organizations such as Conscious Capitalism, some of the social investing momentum that says, look, we got to go back to serving stakeholders, and stakeholders being our customers, our employees, our communities that we operate in, our suppliers, and kind of get back to where capitalism started at the very beginning, which was if we don't take care of all of these other stakeholders, we won't have a future market. And what I talk about is just even expanding the aperture to, the human-centric part is to even go broader, because there's problems that we have across humanity that don't reside just in one community. They reside in thousands of communities. Think climate change or clean water. And, the size of some of the companies that we have now, they operate in hundreds, if not thousands, of communities across the globe. And they have power inside to innovate, to research and develop, and to come up with solutions. And I think, what Beth said is that, you start with meeting people where they're at. And some of these problems, we've got to meet people where they're at, and business has a role in solving that. And it's no longer good enough to hide behind we're here to just maximize shareholder profit. And I think there's pressure mounting and momentum gaining to really open that aperture to human-centric behavior.
So Deb, I'll press that point a little bit before I jump further. Is there, in Convergence, you make this very strong point about, the leaders of yesterday are not going to look like the leaders of today or tomorrow as we move forward. When you think about those strengths and what makes a really strong leader in this world of convergence, how does it differ from what we might have seen, to Beth's point, in business school in the 70s, 80s, and 90s? Like, is there a different mental model we need to think about when we sort of point and say, I am a leader?
Well, I think, leadership can be found everywhere. First of all, it's not just, at the top of the organization. I think leader is anybody that, brings the best out of themselves as well as the group of people that they're around. That's what a leader does. I do think that the attributes of leaders for convergence or human-centric are very different. It's not command and control. It's vulnerability. It's authenticity. It's saying I don't know. It's building trust. It's reaching out. It's collaboration, and those are things that are very different. It's a very human aspect. And I went through business school quite a few years ago too, and we didn't learn these things. We learned about structure, and we learned about process, and we learned about controls and how to move levers and to get output and to get performance. But in a human-centric world where we're having to solve some really hard problems, it's going to take to kind of take our guard down and become ourselves more human, if you would, which means being real and coming out from behind that organizational structure, if you would.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because that's something that struck me in the conversations and the reading too of, Beth, you talked about the business school aspect and what we learn, and Deb, you're highlighting that too, but it does seem like what you're talking about from a leadership perspective in Convergence is about the soft, and Beth, I like what you said, the soft is essential. I mean, what Convergence really lays out is that those soft things, or what we call soft, really are going to be essential moving forward, right? Understanding the currents, metaphorically and literally, around the Galapagos is not a hard skill. That's a softer skill to understand what that ecosystem looks like. And I think what Convergence really drove home for me was taking that big picture, stepping back and looking at that holistic systems. And frankly, Deb, in chapter 6, I like the quotation. You remind anyone that wants to be a leader that, quote, transitioning to a human-centric perspective has a higher probability of positive impact over the long term on profitability, growth, and performance, and not just for shareholders. So bring it back to that comment about shareholder stakeholder, right? Even that is almost dehumanizing. So when you're thinking about that from a big business perspective, how do you see that that human-centric perspective being critical to success in the future for leaders and for businesses? What is that magic thing you see in human-centric that drives profitability?
Well, I mean, and Beth can talk about this too from her experience, but I think, one of the things you can look at is just brand. And, do people feel connected to your brand? Do they, people are smart. If your company is not living out what you say are your values, people are smart. And you can't whitewash it. You can't, so I think that's a big part of it. I think another big part is humans are where innovation resides, and energy and ideas and commitment. And if you don't tap into that as a leader, then you're missing a big aspect here. Hans, you kind of started with the story. There is one of the, you hear it all the time from clients that say, well, people are the problem. And I did have kind of a turning point, an aha moment with a senior vice president of aerospace, and sit down and she's lamenting about the growth of her international business, and she's not making her numbers, and it's the people. She said it's the people. They're just not innovative anymore, and we're not hiring good people. And I really challenged her on that notion, because we'd been working with them for a long time, and I knew that they had these onerous processes that took out any kind of innovation from their people. So and that's the kind of the call inside of the book is you've got to rewire your business. You've got to take some of that structure and those processes and kind of blow them apart and remake to include a human-centric perspective, because, the numbers show that 80% of your human capital inside your business is not polling for you. They're just they're doing what you ask them to do, but they're not bringing all their energy and their innovation. So how do leaders tap into that? And that is that human-centric perspective of how to kind of capture that, and that drops right down to profitability.
It looks, I don't know, Deb and Beth, if you can see the chat, but it looks like Jeff and Julie would agree with the idea that this is less about soft versus hard, and we need to reframe these as, human-centric and human skills. So thanks to everyone that's engaging in that lively chat there. Beth, I want to follow up on chapter 6 as well and pull that thread a little bit. Leadership reboot was something I know that resonated with you as well. Talk to me about what's different about the role of leaders in the future, and how do you see convergence capturing that change? What's going to be different for leaders as we look forward or over the horizon?
Well, I think one of the things just is to reiterate what's been happening in the chat. I mean, those comments are so right. Since when are human skills soft skills? I mean, like, we've really lost our perspective. And we're trying to be something other than human. So I think it's that authenticity is a lot of what Deb's making a case for here. What good leaders do is they prepare for the future. They deal with today, but they prepare for the future. And they have to inspire others to do that. That's a part of it. They have to tell a story. It's not just do it because I said so. They have to say, here's the change that's coming. Here's why we have to be ready. Here's why our customers have to be ready. I built a career in business, but I actually studied biology. And I feel that my biology study was perhaps some of the best framing I could have gotten for business, because what you appreciate when you study, nature, is that it is a convergence of systems. I mean, that's what ecosystems are about. It's the health of everyone moving forward together. And so I think that's really what Deb is talking about, that the leadership reboot that's required now is just a recognition that these things have always been converging. We have to deal with them, and it's putting people at the center. Again, these are so basic, it's almost like embarrassing that we have to call it out, but we do. So I thought that, anyway, that's, I'll kind of end there.
I think it's right. And I think that it's an interesting, I'm looking at the chat too, Deb. I think it's an interesting point as well, because of this fact that, I think it's interesting that you highlight the fact, Beth, that, as a trained biologist, right, by education, but that set you up for success. And I think, Deb, your enjoyment and exploration in finding how the world around, like, this book really was born out of that exploration, not just the work you did at Toffler Associates, but I know how impacted you were by your travels and seeing that ecosystem. And I think that's a really important point that I think shouldn't be lost in what you've done with the book Convergence. You've taken the business ideas that are there and really said, this is more than just a business. This is the human business, the human-centric system. Again, I really like, and probably because of the 15 years we spent working together, I like that idea of future, right? That we need to be taking this into account and thinking about it. But you've done a lot of work with leaders. You've thought a lot about what leadership is going to mean again in the future. What's your advice for new, middle, end of career, wherever you sit on that leadership ladder, building, leading, and managing teams to take advantage of and prepare for the future? What advice would you give to the leaders out there, no matter where they are?
So I think it's important, in the future is important, but you also need to look at the past and see how we're, where we came from. And again, I think, it's, for those leaders going forward, it's understanding that human system. That's the first thing. I do think there is recognizing the gap of where we've been and where we are and where we need to be. Our organizations today are not organized for the future. They are organized very much for something in the past. It was a very industrial time. People had to fit in within the factories. If you just go back and look at how we have, created some of the HR processes that we have around what people can do, what people can't do, how you're described, what your job is, all of that came out of a very, very different time. So recognizing that we have a gap in where we are today with our organization and where we need to be, which means we're going to have to recreate. We're going to have to break some of that down and recreate. And to do that, we have to disrupt decision making. And so, and what do I mean by that? You can, inside an organization, there's so much momentum to keep doing the same thing over and over and over, because that's how we do it. That's what our processes say. If you just even consider the weekly performance check-ins, and you look at, most companies will have, or even government organizations, they'll have, how much revenue, how much sales, how much backlog. Nowhere on that performance platform does it say anything about the human system. It doesn't talk about the other stakeholders. It doesn't talk about the hard problems that we're trying to solve for humanity. And so those are the kind of things you'll have to kind of root out as you're trying to lead your teams. And that is what we call obsolete knowledge. There's obsolete knowledge in what we know, how we do things, what we believe about our market, about ourselves, about our biases, our belief systems, everything around business. And so we have to determine what is obsolete, what we need to shed, and recreate for the future. And then, lastly, just kind of coming full circle is being that future focused leader. It just takes practice. It just takes practice in asking what if, and doing all the things that we just talked about, rooting out the obsolete and understanding that chasm of where we are to where we need to be.
Yeah, and I think that point of obsolete is interesting too, not just because I love the term, but also this idea, back to the perspective from Alvin and Heidi, of those who are going to be successful are going to be able to unlearn and learn as we move forward. So what are the things that you talk in Convergence about? What are those things we need to unlearn as well as move forward and learn in the positive sense? Beth, I want to kind of put you on the spot a little bit. You've written your own book. You've obviously written the foreword to Deb's book. And looking broadly, what are your takeaways from this book and its value to any reader, whether they're in a leadership role or whether they just want to explore what the future might hold?
Well, I think you're exactly right, Hans. I think hopefully everyone feels some part of their existence is to understand what the future may hold. I mean, you can't spend your whole life in that, but so I think this is a good place to start. I think you can make the argument that Deb's book, if boil it down, it's about resilience. I love some of the comments here, and Aditya she says, you could point to the skills, human skills are what allowed us to survive these turbulent months of COVID. And so again, I'm optimistic that leaders are coming kind of back to, not that people went away from work, but are kind of coming back a bit more tuned in to the fact that they need different things to navigate the convergence of trends and the unpredictability and the speed. Deb talks about the horizons have narrowed. And so I think people have to come into this understanding that change is accelerating exponentially. I think that for me, that was one of the reasons I felt it necessary to write a book, because I realized in large organizations and frankly small ones, an inertia sets in, especially if you've been successful. You think you can outrun change, and then you wake up one day and you realize you can't. Oh, that solar energy we thought was never going to come here, it's here today. We missed it. So I do think that everybody's job now, and in part, is thinking about the future, making room for discovering what's changing. And I think it becomes a practice, and there are ways to do that. But I think Deb gets you started here in a very powerful way.
Yeah, and Deb, even personal to that, I always found it interesting, reading Convergence, I thought, to Beth's point, the convergence I thought of as I was reading it too is this convergence of like business and personal, like the human aspect of, we do a lot of these things quite well in a home life. We think, what if XYZ were to happen with my family? What would I do? How would I react? How might I plan? And we go to work and we say, well, that's not my responsibility. I've got a quarterly earnings. So I think what really struck me too about this convergence is the metaphor fits for so many parts of what the future is going to look like. Because, you see things like the gig economy and I'm not going to work for 40 years for the same company. I think you do that very well in highlighting how the convergence is relevant no matter your industry, no matter your position, no matter where you stand in your career. Beth, you mentioned, why you wrote Imagine It Forward. I'd like to, before we open it up for some questions, Deb, I'd like to put to you your own, how did you write the book? What drove you to, put in the hours? It's a lot of work to put this stuff together, and I congratulate you on accomplishing it. But what made you take on that challenge?
Yeah, it's a lot of work, but I wanted to be a part of the dialogue. I wanted to bring my energy in my voice and my passion to this, and just add it to this growing list of people, growing number of voices calling for change. And you're right, Hans. The convergence is, there's so many different convergences. There's so many what ifs. There's so many things that we got to be looking at and questioning and asking ourselves, is this the direction that we want to go, or do we need to make changes? And so I wanted to write the book to be able to just kind of stimulate that dialogue. It's not a how-to book. My hope is that people read it and they ask questions and they ask what ifs, and they're motivated to talk with each other and do research and wonderment about some of these issues. And so, that's why I wrote it.
Well, you've already started a dialogue here in the chat, so I mean that's got to be a good sign already. I'll say right now, I'm going to open it up for questions. If you click the Ask a Question button, you can throw your questions in there. And as people are thinking about what you want to ask, Deb, I had a couple folks that couldn't attend, and they, using the magic of technology, sent me a few questions ahead of time. So I'm going to go off some of the questions that came in.
Okay.
So folks that were thinking about convergence, how is this different than corporate responsibility? Like, what are the aspects of your perspective on convergence as it differs from this emerging corporate responsibility or ESG and all these other things that are out there now?
So I think corporate responsibility, there is some good that it's in there, but I do think that's a notion, and it's a function inside organizations that have probably outlived their usefulness, because they're very stovepiped into and controlled into what they're going to do, what they're not going to do. And in some companies, corporate responsibility programs have become check writing, to highlight, look how good we are. We just gave a check for, $1,000 or $100,000 to this organization. The question is, did you solve any problems? And I think that's what is different in corporate responsibility. Also, if you look at it inside a business, it is a function. It is a office. It's usually an office that's underfunded. It has very little to do with the larger purpose of the company. And, so what I'm talking about is not an overlay. It's, which, and maybe I'm too harsh with corporate responsibility, but what I'm talking about is the need for the organization to truly define itself by its purpose and to live out those values, not assign it to another, to a small organization off to the side to write a check.
Okay.
And Beth can add to that her thoughts.
That's what I was going to say. I mean, Beth, what are your perspectives on that? I mean, how do they differ? Are they different when you think of convergence and the way the future is shaping up?
Well, I thought Deb said it pretty well. I mean, they are different in some respects. Yet I think what I'm corporate social responsibility, ESG, where I've been spending a lot of time in the past year or so. They're all good movements. They're all starting to understand that these trends are converging. It's not just one thing. You have to look at all of these. I mean, I've seen this in the environmental space. Oftentimes people are, especially investors now are investing more in the space and recognizing it's not enough to just be good in one. Okay, yeah, we've done well in the environment, but what are we doing in social and governance, for example? So I think that just the recognition that these things are converging makes Deb's case. But they are different in many ways. I mean, you're talking here about the convergence of many different forces, and ESG or corporate social responsibility, whatever label you want to get it, too often gets, again, delegated. It's like people delegating the future. We're just delegating it to someone else to deal with. These are factors that everyone has to deal with.
Yeah.
There was a really interesting, so I am very hopeful for the ESG movement because of some of the talk of turning it into who gets money, who gets funding, how are we going to report this? There was an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal just a couple of days ago about Warren Buffett and Larry Fink, and they're pushing very hard to show that responsibility, and Warren Buffett is saying not during my time. So I am very hopeful that the that ESG movement, that social responsibility continues. But what that's going to mean is bigger changes inside the organization to really report that, really embrace it, versus what a corporate responsibility office was in the past.
The other thing I think, Deb, that you're making me think of is what Deb lays out so well in Convergence is just being aware of kind of the world outside you. And in organizations, we often people are set up by functions or responsibilities for specific actions. And what Deb's making the case for is you have to look outside yourself. You have to really kind of organize yourself for the way the world is flowing and kind of be organized. You can't compartmentalize it so much the way we have historically. You can't just throw money at the problem and assume it's going to be solved.
Absolutely.
So, Deb, how do you balance, or how would you suggest one balances that long-term and short-term? You and I have talked about the race car metaphor and other metaphors of what we're doing, but a lot of companies, they might want to look over that horizon, but they have to hit quarterly targets, or they have other short-term, dare I say, stakeholder needs. Are there any ways that you can consider or advising some folks that have that? How do they have that longer perspective or build some of that in from their leadership?
I think you can't, they're not going to be able to solve everything and pick everything, but pick the one thing that you want to make a big impact. For example, water. Water is important to all of us. It's also important to every company that makes anything, whether it's pharmaceutical companies or food or fabric, fashion. Water is, sustains manufacturing companies, and it will not just manufacturing companies, energy and everything. Plus, it's needed by all humans on the planet, right? And you don't necessarily get rewarded for a water management strategy if you're a CEO or a leader of the company today. But if we do something to destroy our water sources and not take care of our water, you're not going to have a market for the future. Right. And so, that has to, that is leadership, is to say, look, it's the right thing to do. I can't leave this problem or add to the problem for my successor. I can't just get in there and get my piece of the reward and leave it to be somebody else's problem. So, pick the problem that you want to, focus on, and then really commit to that. And I think that's where you start. And that does bridge the short term and the long term.
Good. I've got two questions. I'm gonna throw them in from the audience. The first question is, how can we apply these principles to organizations that are not set up like a corporation, that is a university or research institution whose goal is human well-being? Deb, thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's I think they all apply. It's, you look at the human system, you understand your organization. I would say that those organizations have been created for something in the past and not the future. And, root out the obsolete, and then disrupt the decision-making internally to pivot towards a human-centric behavior. I think they apply. Whether you're a profit business or you're a nonprofit, or if you're in the government, which you're trying to achieve a mission, all of these apply.
Okay. It says a question for both Deb and Beth, and I'll let you jump in as you see fit. Nearly 2 years after the BRT statement, how would you assess its impact and the performance of the signers in following through on their commitments? So I'm assuming, Jeff, that's about the business roundtable and the question of defining the shareholder. So,
yeah, so I think they're making progress. I think, and I do write about that in the book, that said, they signed it, and there was a big, big celebration, and we are no longer, the sole purpose of a business is no longer to only focus on shareholders, but to a broader stakeholders. I think in some cases, COVID kind of maybe threw a wrench in things with with some people wanting to make that pivot. In some cases, those human-centric organizations really behaved in a way, and it just kind of accelerated their momentum. I think the debates that are happening now, and they're broad, and they're wide. Bloomberg had a climate change summit just a couple weeks ago, and there were leaders of the Business Roundtable there talking about this. And they're trying to figure out, how do we measure our progress? How do we report our progress? Is there a common measurement across the businesses to talk about the progress? So I do think, there's probably no end state, but the journey that they're taking is all in a positive direction, I believe. It's hard because we have spent decades operating the way we're operating now. It's not going to take just 2 years to make this pivot, but I think what we need to look at and be future focused about is what are the activities that are pointing towards that positive in the future.
Good.
I agree with Deb. I think it's very positive. I hope it continues and accelerates. It's back to good leadership. I mean, good leaders realize they have to think about all stakeholders. It's not just your shareholders. That is changing. I think one of the great things that's happening now is just a lot of employee activism is reminding companies that, yeah, employees count. Customers always have the ability for activism. They don't have to buy your product. Again, that Peter Drucker quote, without a customer, there is no business. They don't have to do business with you if they don't like what you stand for. And I do think the best companies are the leaders that appreciate these convergent aspects and get ahead of these trends rather than waiting for legislation or some body to tell them that that's what they have to do. I mean, look at what's happened with corporate boards, and you've now got California. It started first in Europe, and now you've got in the U.S. California mandating the amount of women that need to, and diverse candidates that need to be on corporate boards. Do we need it to come to this? We have, because there haven't been enough. So I think the best leaders and the best companies are the ones that recognize this and get ahead of it so that they take care of it before they're forced to do it, because they realize it's the right thing to do. Again, ecosystem, everybody works together to figure out how do we all succeed.
Good. I've got one last question. I think we got time for it, and it's for Deb. It says the National Science Foundation is now using a convergence accelerator to help define successful proposals. Actually, proposers must go through extensive convergence training as final proposals are developed. Have you any experience in this approach, in that multidisciplinary approach? It seems to sort of represent some of the things you're talking about. Have you seen that anywhere else, National Science Foundation or elsewhere?
I'm not sure exactly what the National Science Foundation is doing on this. It sounds like a multidisciplinary review of the proposals, which is fantastic. And it depends on who that multidisciplinary is too. So I think that if it is in the broadest sense, I think that is, I think that's really great. I think it's also, there's a temporal aspect there. It's not just the disciplinary looking at the problem, but it's also a temporal, from a time aspect, capturing this future and today. And so how are we making that consideration, I think is really important.
Good. Well, we're wrapped up, getting close to time. I want to make sure, are there any other questions that are out there? Give folks a second. But Beth, thank you for joining us. It was wonderful to see you again after a couple of years and have this conversation. But most importantly, Deb, thank you very much. On a personal level, I couldn't be more proud to actually have a hard copy of your book in my hands. And I would encourage everyone to buy lots of copies for themselves and all their friends and colleagues and coworkers. But, don't forget to click the button at the bottom. And Deb, Beth, thank you so much for taking the time. And Deb, congratulations again on the book. It's great.
Yeah, congratulations, Deb. Really great to be part of this. Well done.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And thank you both for supporting. This has been fantastic. So thank you.
Yep. Thank you all so much for joining us. Congratulations, Deborah, on the book. Just a reminder, you can purchase copies at Madison Street Books. We have signed book plates that will go in each of those copies. We can ship, or you can pick up in Chicago in the West Loop, which is where we're located. But thank you so much for joining us. Everyone have a great rest of your evening. Goodbye.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.